Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, too. The one in Australia or wherever you are. Welcome to the CAIPSDCC webinar, The Global Perspectives on Sustainable Landscape Management in Times of COVID-19. This webinar is organized by CAIPSDCC, the Collaborative Australia-Indonesia Programs on Sustainable Development and Climate Change, a collaboration between Universitas Indonesia and Griffith University Australia. So welcome Bapak Ibu dimanapun berada from all over Indonesia and then also Australia and then I saw some other countries as well. This is great. We have 750 participants so far registered to our event. But this capacity is 500, but don't worry, I guess you all can also see it through YouTube. Let me check whether the YouTube feature is already on. I think it is already on, so that's great. Hello as well from the participants who are watching it from YouTube. We're sorry that you could join in the Zoom because we have a lot of demands for this, so I think it's great. So we are going to have a nice and meaningful discussion on the state of sustainable landscape management in terms of COVID-19. Today we have a wonderful speakers and then also a chair that will guide all of us in the discussion onto this. And then before that, I would like to say some housekeeping rules or on how we're going to do this. So we are now having more than 150 participants. And thank you for joining. And then to make this discussion smoothly, we would encourage people to also later to be interactive in the discussion session. You could introduce yourself now by saying your names, where your organization is, and then where you come from, the city or country, in the chat box, so that you can say hi to the panelists and the attendees. So you could set your message to be sent to the attendees and panelists, not only the panelists, so that the other attendees can also see your messages. We got a lot of messages right now here. There is from Gorontalo, Hasanuddin, from Jakarta, Jambi, Mula Warman University, from Kediri, from everywhere. East Nusa Tenggara, from Australia, a lot. So thank you very much. Oh, ada Hans. Hi, Hans, from Mongabai, from Bandung. Yeah, and it's still coming. So thank you for joining in. This is a weekly webinar that is organized by CAIPSDCC because we are a research collaboration between the two universities and also some other universities in Indonesia, Universitas Hasanuddin, and then also some other universities in other countries. And then our focus is to advance the research collaboration in the area of climate change and sustainable developments. And then we have a research focusing on sustainable landscape management, on health and climate change, on response measure or the impact of climate actions on the economy, and then also the adaptation action of climate change in eastern part of Indonesia. So we are trying to bring up that themes into the weekly webinar to match our condition right now, the new normal, I guess you could say, that this is how we can do stuff. We can meet with a lot of people across Indonesia and also abroad as well through this online platform. And how great it is that we could still continue on the fight against climate change and then also pursue sustainable development through activities like this. And then so later you could also write down your question on the Q&A section. So the Q&A section is only for questions. If you want to introduce yourself, you could use the chat. And then if you want to ask questions, you could write it down in Q&A, not the chat, so that we could differentiate both. And then before you write down question letter, please also read the question before you. And if there is any question that is similar to your question, you can just give it a thumb up, upvote it, so that you don't have to write down that question again, because we only have limited time, so we could not answer all of the questions that might enter here. Like the previous webinars, we have like around 40 or 50 questions. So we will answer the questions that have the most thumbs up. So make sure that you read that first and then you write it down. All right, without further ado, oh yeah, my name is Lia Zakia. I'm the program coordinator for the CAIPSDCC. I'm based in Jakarta. And then together with Handika, we are organizing this weekly. So hopefully this time it will all be smooth and then we will have meaningful discussion. So before we begin the discussion, I would like to invite our honorable guest today that will give the opening remarks and also opening this webinar, which is Professor Abdul Haris, the Vice Rector of Universitas Indonesia on Research and Innovation. He has been following the CAIPSDCC progress since the beginning, and then now he is the Vice Rector in Universitas Indonesia, overseeing the research and innovation. It's great to have you with us, Pak. And then, ladies and gentlemen, everywhere you are, please give a warm welcome by giving some applause, round of applause, because, you know, why not? Because even though we are all doing it online, we still have to keep the spirit up. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Prof. Abdul Haris. Pak Abdul Haris, you should unmute yours. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Lia. His Excellency Professor Rahmat Witular. I do expect him to be here with us in the mornings, and also the Professor Kathleen Birner, the Director of Griffith Asia Institute. I think also he should be joined with us in this morning. And Prof. Brendan, how is going? Everything going well? And also, Prof. Yatna is Director of Sustainable Earth and Resource Universitas Indonesia, and also Pak Fitrian Ardiansyah, Chairman of Executive Board Initiative Dagang Hijau, and also Mrs. Maggie Murman. I think is already joined with us. You have a nice background, Maggie. And also all participants from Indonesia, from Australia, and other countries. Good morning and also good afternoon for our colleagues from Australia. And ladies and gentlemen, it is great honor for me to welcome you and to deliver opening remark on the webinar Global Perspective on Sustainable Landscape Management in Time of COVID-19. I am very grateful to all our prominent guests, prominent speaker, and also all participants who have spent time to be with us to attend this webinar virtually. I follow and appreciate the progressive ICER activities even in the pandemic situation. This webinar is part of the ICER program under the framework of collaborative Australia-Indonesian program on sustainable development on climate change, which is a collaboration between Universitas Indonesia and Griffith University, Australia. I think this is one of our way to keep the discussion live about this important issue amid this pandemic, which has required us to maintain the social and physical distancing following all the health protocol. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there have been many studies behind the spread of COVID-19 pandemic. Among others, the existence of the wildlife market for human consumption and global air travel. However, one the key factor that may also have contributed to the emergence of the virus has been somewhat overlooked, with its deforestation and the destruction of the natural ecosystem. Combined with the other circumstances, deforestation of natural habitat, human population growth, and interspecies contact is being big health risk for human society. In 2018, scientists have warned then the probability of the currency of the risk, I think such as this pandemic, is increasing owing to environmental change and higher environmental pressures. Ladies and gentlemen, the world society is currently trying to recover from the grave economic impact caused by this pandemic. There are caution from the scientists that the recovery effort will put more pressure on natural ecosystem, which will put us in the endless cycle of battling with disaster and pandemic and environmental damage. We cannot afford to do this anymore. Come and listen.
Kalau mau
hadir
nggak kelihatan gimana?
Yang video.
Sorry, we continue. There are many lessons that can be learned from spread of COVID-19. One of them is to ensure that we are building back our economy. It needs to be conducted with sustainable and low carbon paradigm to ensure the protection of natural ecosystem and tackling climate change, which in the end will help us to prevent the possible future pandemics. Ladies and gentlemen, Universitas Indonesia aim to become the center of excellence in research and science in Asia. So during this pandemic, Universitas Indonesia has continued to hold an important role as knowledge and innovation engine. We continue to expand our contribution by collaborating with other education institutions on research and innovations, capacity building, student mobility, and science to policy dialogue. I think this is very important why we are here today. Together with partners from Griffith University, Australia, also other stakeholders such as NGO and businesses, we support this type of activity with the goal of communicating the issue with each other and also engaging the public in the meaningful discussion. We also expect to develop policy brief to contribute to public policy, which is based on data and scientific evidence. I think during this pandemic, we are surprising because all our academic member is very productive in delivering such kind of sharing of the idea and also sharing, and so we have many productive in innovation that already produce in quick time. Because for example, Universitas Indonesia also has produced such a ventilator in only 1 month. I mean, based on the prototype. But also right now, we already produce and already passed from the examination, from the clinical examination, and right now already in market more than 500 ventilator. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part of our effort, how we contribute to the society and to government in handling the pandemic COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thankful to all participants, to all prominent speakers, and our colleagues coming from Australia for the enthusiasm to join this webinar. And I hope we all can learn some important lessons and find way to take stronger action toward the fight against the pandemic and the fight against the climate crisis. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Prof. Abdul Haris. And then moving on. Yeah, thank you very much. And then you are in the office right now, yeah? So, ladies and gentlemen, now we can move on to the discussion. But before that, I would just like to say hi to Pak Rahmat Witular. Halo, Bapak. Oh, you are unmute. Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Hi.
Yes.
Good speech, Faris. Faris, good speech. Thank you. Hope to hear you.
Yeah, Pak Rahmat Witular is the the head of the advisor advisory board for CAIPSDCC. So he's very crucial or like critical in creating all this together. So without his role in here, we won't be here. And then I also would like to say hi to Prof. Caitlin Byrne, the director of Griffith Asia Institute from Griffith University. Prof. Caitlin, can you show yourself, please?
Hi there, Leah. Hi, everyone. Selamat pagi. Terima kasih, Prof. Harris. It was so good to hear from you. A real honor that you are with us today. And also, Pak Rahmat Witala, thank you again for joining us today. One of the really good things about our virtual connection, I think, is we talk even more today, which is really great. And we're able to share our ideas and thoughts. I'm so excited to see so many participants.
It's one of the advantages of the corona, is you can meet more often than usual.
I think so. It's getting us used to this environment. I'm really excited to see so many people.
Yeah. Thank you, Leah.
Okay, thank you, Pak Rahmat, and thank you, Prof. Caitlin. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time for me to introduce our chair for the discussion today, which is Mrs. Maggie Moormans. She was born in Indonesia but raised in the Netherlands, and now work in Australia. And Maggie has over 19 years experience in community engagement and community-based conservation in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Oceania. Her projects include the establishment of community conservation areas, protected areas management, and alternative livelihood developments. And then Maggie is currently a PhD candidate at Griffith University, researching about community engagement in conservation. And then one of her research is conducted through the CAIPSDCC framework, together with Pak Zulianto Zakaria here, under the supervision of Prof. Yatna and Prof. Brandon, under this framework. So it's good. Hopefully they can conduct their research together, and then we'll have the results soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Miss Maggie Moormans. Maggie, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Leah, and welcome and thank you for joining us in this webinar today. It's obviously an event hosted by Universitas Indonesia and Griffith University Australia. I'm delighted to chair this webinar and delighted to introduce three distinguished guests. So first of all, we have Professor Jatna Supriyatna, who is connected to Universitas Indonesia as a senior lecturer. Professor Jatna has received a number of accolades for his work in environment, from awards from Dutch royalty to Indonesian presidential awards. He has completed his doctorate and postdoctorate degrees in the United States at the University of New Mexico and Columbia University, and is a member of a number of committees and roles to bring conservation and the environment high on the agenda, such as his role as an executive director with Conservation International for Indonesia for 15 years. Now, other recent roles and research have a focus on climate change policy and sustainable development, and Professor Jatna has also authored a number of publications on Indonesia's primates and Indonesia's biodiversity. His work towards the environment has been recognized as well in such manner that we have even a tarsier, which is a curious little primate home to Sulawesi, been named after Professor Jatna as well. Our second guest is Professor Brendan Mackey, who is connected to Griffith University here in Australia and is director of the university's Climate Action Beacon. The Climate Action Beacon is a collaboration between a number of organisations and universities working towards enabling effective and just climate action throughout society, using both research and practice-driven responses. Professor Mackey is a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we may have all heard of this when dealing with climate statistics. IPCC also refer to often, 6th assessment report, and working group impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. Professor Brennan has a PhD in ecology from the Australian National University and has published over 240 academic publications in the fields of climate change impacts and adaptation, ecosystems and biodiversity, land use policy, planning and management. And on a personal note, Professor Brennan has also been a wonderful mentor and inspiration for my own work, and somehow always finds time in his busy schedule to provide guidance and create ideas. And last, but definitely not least, we are joined by Mr. Fitrin Ardiansyah. Fitrin brings a wealth of experience in the field of ecological and environmental economics, natural resource management, land use planning, sustainable forest management, and climate change. He has experience in Australia and Indonesia and other locations in the Asia Pacific. And Mr. Fitrin is a member of a number of boards and committees that find synergies between the agricultural sector and sustainability, such as the Indonesian Climate Alliance and the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change. Mr. Fitrin has completed his master's degree here in Australia with the Australian National University, and he's one of the experts on the Indonesia Forest Climate Alliance, focusing in developing the framework of RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And I'm confident that the contribution from our panel will be very valuable, and we're very fortunate to have the opportunity today for their counsel. So these are our three guests, but before we go any further, I would just like to acknowledge where we are coming to you from, or where I am coming to you from. I'm located at my house here in Tugun, which is on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia, and it is tradition in Australia to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. So I would just like to acknowledge the Kumameri people of this region and pay respects to our elders past and present and emerging from these people, as well as the people and lands from the participants that have joined us today. So let us begin with setting the scene with some introductory remarks and then put some questions to our guests. As mentioned by Leah before, Zoom allows you to write questions to us, and by giving an indication of the popularity of these questions, you could like or upvote the questions that may be popular, and allows us to feed these questions through to the panel. I do want to acknowledge in advance, we have a lot of people registered and a lot of people attending, so we probably don't have time to answer all questions, but we'll do our best. So that's the introductions and technicalities out of the way. Let me just begin with making a few introductory and opening remarks. And clearly one of the significant reasons we are meeting like this online as opposed to face-to-face is because we are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated implications, and in particular, how it may have affected the natural landscape. And what this crisis has revealed is that even without a looming pandemic, the majority of emerging infectious disease events are caused by zoonotic pathogens, and due to an increase in life expectancy, it has also come with the degradation on a large scale of nature's ecological system. And now we've entered this era of a pandemic, we've seen changes in our natural ecological system, and I have accounts from colleagues working in conservation in Europe, Africa, South America, and Australia, that there has been an increase of pressure on our natural ecosystems. On the other hand, I've learned about experiences of a recovery of ecosystems and habitats due to the stay-at-home orders in place in many countries. So there are definitely two sides to the story, and we could potentially discuss some of the positives as well as the negative factors of the pandemic we find ourselves in. Some countries have done reasonably well, and others are in a more precarious situation. So things that we'll have to confront now are things like, have we seen any impacts on natural resources extraction in Indonesia or perhaps Australia? How are we able to anticipate these impacts in the future if we want to secure an economic growth? And how can we find synergies between landscape management and responding to a pandemic? So what I would like to do is give the floor to each of our speakers to shed some light on this, and we'll then open up for some discussion. Professor Jatna, would you like to go first in presenting some of your thoughts, and especially whether you have seen any effects of deforestation rates in Indonesia since the pandemic has started earlier this year? We're just pulling up the screen. And you're still on mute, Professor Jatna. If you unmute, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Prof. Haris, Prof. Rahmat Bitular, Pak Fitrian, and Leah, and also good afternoon, Prof. Brandon, Prof. Kathleen. So, ladies and gentlemen, the webinar's participants. So, my title will be discussing about sustainable landscapes, deforestation, and COVID-19. So, next slide, it will be what does really mean with the sustainable landscape. Sustainable landscape. Landscape consists of many ecosystem, from the mountains area up to the forests and rural areas and up to the coastal areas. That is all the landscape. But what does really mean with the sustainable landscape? Sustainable landscape, basically, it's seeking a balance between production and protection. So the characteristic of this sustainable landscape is you cannot be short-term, they should be long-term. They should be collaborative among diverse stakeholders. You should be balancing with multiple conflicting objectives. It's not going to be only one, and in scales. The nature of the landscapes are socio-ecological system. It's not ecology, it's not social, it's combining what you call it socio-ecological system. What is in the social ecosystem? It's a local property. It's the land use conflict, it's always that. It's a civil military conflict, disorder, agriculture expansions. The other one is also donor fatigue, invasive species, and so on. And one of those is also the tyranny of small decision. They're very important sometimes. So if you look at the next slide, is you can see that the landscape continuum between the intact forests, the transformation, and the fragmented. So what does really mean the landscape management? Is managing biodiversity and ecosystem process in the intact forests or intact areas. And the fragmented, it's an in-between, which is basically the trade-off between production and protection, where ecosystem sources is in fragmented landscape, where in the transformation, it's really based on the sustainable production and how that water qualities, water nutrition management. So basically, sustainable forest management is supporting food production, similarly with the ecosystem conservation, and also rural livelihood across entire landscape. So the next slide, it will be what does really sustainability landscape? It's really big things because 1.6 billion people depend on forests. Out of 7 billion is 1.6 billion. 31% of global areas, 80% of terrestrial biodiversity in the forest, 10 million people employed directly, and 65 to 80% of our medicine coming from the forest, and $460 billion revenue, which means that is about more than 1% of the world GDP. So sustainability for this landscape is very fundamental. It's a fundamental shift in the competitive landscape. So business and the creative landscape, the trade and gaming change opportunities. So it's really interconnectiveness between in the landscape areas, between forests and other sectors. That's really the main drivers. But what that really means for the landscape is basically it's really on the how do we evaluating the asset? It's very important because of course that very important to have what I mean for the landscape is trying to find the viable alternative as business as usual, and the alternative model for development, and then at the same time retain natural and communities, but also we're trying not to reduce environmental and biodiversities. So if you see that, how do we value environmental asset? Because basically in the landscape, if we are not really valuing the potential and also current asset, it will be not be going to see the trade-off. Which one has to be done? Which one has to be carry over, carry out also. Next. So, for example, sometimes if you look at the landscape, landscape, it's very important For example, let's see the forest. What is the forest? The forest is basically hydrological cycle. That's like a sponge effect. So basically all the water retains in the forest, and slowly they will release it. That's why in the tropic, it's very important to have forests, because all this water is basically retained in the forest. So buttress, root, leaf, return fertile soil only less than 1 meter deep. Compared to non-tropic, they can be 30 to 40 meters. So the difference is, that's why if you're trying to cut the trees in the tropic, means that they're going to be desertification, because the tropic is only 1 meter deep of the fallible soil. Next slide. It is lesson learned. After many, many years, we're working in the landscape. What that really means that the environmental issue has been so reactive compared to the others. So, but I think the environmentalists need to help steer development, not to attempt to halt it. It's because that in the landscape sustainability is very important that it's also considered to have local people. Local people is very important. What does really mean the lesson learned? We have been using the science for the landscape. For example, the Professor Jeffrey Sayer has been doing this, the science for sustainable landscape. So the science is there, the trade-off analysis, viability analysis, suitability analysis for commodities, life cycle analysis, and many others, the science there. Then also the multi-criteria analysis that done for us recently in Merauke. It is an example of how that we lesson learned from that. The next slide is going to be, it's the Indonesia. This is an example of Indonesia has, it's a very big countries, 100 million hectares forest more. And then the concentration of those forests is in the 4 big provinces, Papua and West Papua, North Kalimantan, and if this one is really a big forest. So this is really our asset in the future, either for climate change or for NDC. Next. Next slide, please. This is the unfortunate. You know, if you see that agriculture land, as I mentioned before, that is going to up and up and up. It's going to be converting forests into this agriculture. If you see that the biggest one is, of course, the oil palm. Oil palm up to now is about 16 million hectares. It's 1.5 size of Java, if they cumulate it and put it to one-way islands. So this prediction is going up and up. So I think that's really the, it's one thing that's the trade-off between oil palm and many other is a very important research currently. Next. And deforestation is really big, is Indonesia, especially Sumatra. You see that the red one has been deforested since 12 years up to 2012. You can see the 5 million hectare loss in between those areas until 2000. And then after that is more deforestation happen. The driver is, of course, this oil palm, then so on and so on. And you see that is my research also on the impact of the infrastructures. You can see the road development, the oil palm, and many others. There was really impact to the existing forests. And deforestation now is only in the part of the northern part of Borneo. Kalimantan, which is now as the green one. So that because of the mountainous areas, it's very difficult to get to that. And that's why really the remaining forest left there. The next slide, you can see that even in Sulawesi, for example, the mining, because Sulawesi basically is the area, the island where the lot of mining, because there is a deposit mine is so big in Sulawesi. But the similar thing is also because of the cocoa and many other commodities agricultures in a small scale and the differences. So biodiversity, even in the forest, is still decline in our landscape. See that more than 50% of those biodiversity habitat is lost because the forests also lost. Rhino, for example, in Sumatra is only 80 left in Aceh, in northern Sumatra, and also the elephants and many others. It's very alarming for us because if the biodiversity means also if the habitat, which is that deforestation is going on. Next. Let's go. What does really mean deforestation into happen to the zoonosis? It's mentioned by Maggie. So if you see that from the top begin, when they have still farming, agriculture, and hunting, there's still biodiversity there. They still left a lot of things. There's still intact biodiversity. Under that, you can see there's logging concession coming and so much deforestation. And below that, you can see there's so many food production, food preference. That's also broad building. That's why we are very close to the wildlife. That's really happened. So when the forest is decreased, and then you can see that the human and wildlife, it's becoming closer and closer. That's really the possible zoonosis. Next. And you can see that from that, how that really the spillover. You can see from the left side, the four big animals, which is bat, rodents, primates, and these pigs. And this is really the one that usually spill over toward the domestic animal or directly to human. And the spillover, which means that this the zoonotic, is you can see that infectious disease is really 60% of this current disease, and 70% is also, more than 70% is new emerging disease. It costs a lot of money, right? So what does it really mean with COVID-19? So zoonosis, compare, especially coronavirus, is SARS-CoV, MERS-CoV, SARS-CoV-2, is all this coronavirus. So 2/3 of the agent that cause human disease are naturally transmitted from animal to humans. So if you can see that, what is really spillover? Animal, human, stop is kind of rabies, bird flu, H5N1. Human, animal, human, stop is hepatitis, TBC, because of it. But animals, human, stop, it is Ebola, MERS-CoV, and SARS-CoV. But this is the COVID-2. Animals, human, animals. So it's more than everybody. It's more than other disease. That's why they are so becoming pandemic, because it's so easy to transmit it. Next. So this is the 4 animal with more zoonosis than other animals. Next. So how that is primary host of pathogen life grow and reproduction. In the right side, you can see that in several areas, we can still eating the wildlife. Look at the bananas and this one. So the wildlife, the surfer, and trying to get to the domestic animal. This is really, really important. How that really from the reservoir host into the. And so, next slide. is you can see that wet market in Indonesia, of course, the wet market in Wuhan is the one that making the pandemic. But also don't forget, Indonesia has a wet market. The wildlife market, the biggest one is in Tomohon because they still eating all the bats, all the many other wildlife. Similarly in Jakarta, don't pass too long, too far. This is in Jakarta. You can see in Pasar Pramuka, in Bengkulu, and many others. I think this is really important. Maybe if you don't close it, it may be spill over will sometime, I don't know, in the future, maybe in Indonesia. So this is really important. We have to close this wet market in Indonesia. Similarly, that Wuhan already closed a wet market. I think all over the world now is the trend to close this wet market. Next slide. So in the scientific area, what you call biodiversity and dilution effect. Dilution means increased biodiversity in the area means to reduce susceptibility to infectious disease and community. Why is it? Because when high biodiversity, they can buffer against disease transmission. So once biodiversity lost, they easily imbalance in the ecosystem. So one is reducing the population densities of an important natural reservoir for pathogen, reducing the population of arthropod factor, and many others. So that's really important. So the next one is the COVID crisis. No, not yet. The COVID crisis, which is, if you can see that, it's you see that in Wuhan, 40% less use coal energy during 11 weeks lockdown, air quality improved 11%. If you can see that the pictures in the right side, between the very dark compared to the very light. So similarly, after the crisis, this is a very important for everybody. After the crisis, for example, the Ebola crisis, the government trying to boost the economy by converting the forests. I think similarly, because of the COVID, the Colombia government said we'll use digital technology for community consultation, mean that they don't speak the communities. So it will be created a conflict. In Indonesia, lesson learned when the financial crisis in 1997, we also has a lot of protected area encroached by community because this forest is easy cash for them, And also you can see that proposed to revitalize the mega rice project in Kalimantan. Recently, this is proposed by the government in order to get the crisis. Be aware of this going to be happen. Next. So this is the last slide of mine. How do we get this preventing deforestation, which means no more zoonosis? First thing is that we have so many degraded land. So which means that we really need to have land rehabilitation of degraded land, degraded forests. The second one, the enforcement for not having wildlife trade, and wildlife pets, and many others. It is very important not to have it because the pet is going to be the secondary host for the infection. The third one, disseminating on the important wildlife toward the habitats. What does it really mean? We really need to have the good protected area and so on and so on. The fourth one needs more support for wildlife and zoonosis research, because that is really the link that very. As you can see in the left side, forest as a vaccine. There's so many. Find the medicine in our forest because our forest is one of the highest biodiversities in the world. The number 6 is we need one health. What does it mean? One health for humans, for animal and ecosystem. So because those are interconnected, so we cannot say that one health for human, but also not regardless to the ecosystem. There has to be both. The last one is the government has one map policy, one also map data. So that's really good to be supported. the last one that I want to say that landscape is not standalone. Landscape, it really need to be coordinated, to collaborate in multidisciplinary ways, transboundary and cross-sectoral approach, so that we cannot risk of this originate of the animals human ecosystem interface. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that the 10 minutes is okay past that. Thank you very much, Maggie.
Thank you, Professor Jatna, and it was great to hear your thoughts on obviously finding a balance between production and protection, and some insights on defining sustainable landscape management for people that aren't really sort of familiar with that definition, and what that looks like in supporting food production and ecosystem conservation as well, and some of the implications of post-pandemic landscape as well. I do realise we have some questions that have come in already, but I'd just like to give Professor Brendan Mackey and Mr. Fitchen the opportunity first to sort of share their thoughts with us before we going into questions that might apply to all panelists. So Professor Brendan, would you mind sharing your presentation with us and maybe give your thoughts on the role of primary forest protection in mitigating carbon emissions? Obviously, there is deforestation that has been evident, and what are the impacts for that as well for mitigating carbon emissions, and your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you, Maggie. And can I just ask if you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone who's been acknowledged. And many thanks to Professor Jatna for that excellent presentation. And I want to pick up on and expand a couple of the points that he raised. And he talked about the importance of intact forests. I'm here using the term primary forest, their equivalent terms. I talk about primary forest because that's the terminology used by the FAO and the Convention of Biological Diversity and IUCN. But we're essentially talking about the same thing. And these are forests that are largely the result of natural processes, ecological and evolutionary processes, and have not been subject to commercial commodity production or large-scale clearance for commercial agriculture. But all of them have got traditional villages and local communities who have been living in them sustainably for long periods of time. And I want to talk about the role they have to play as part of sustainable landscape management, because they're an important component of all landscapes, whether there's very large areas of them or whether there's only small remnant patches of them. We really need to be understanding the particular values that they have and their contribution to the broad concept of landscape management. And if we look around the world, this is some work that we're doing for the FAO. This is using Earth Systems data, and it's a map of the world's current forest cover, defined using the FAO definition of a forest, which is about a half a hectare of land, which has a canopy at least 5 meters in height and over 10% tree cover. The point I want to make here is that not all forests are equal. So there's only a subset of all that forest cover, 4.06 billion hectares, which represents primary or intact forests. And about half of the world's remaining primary forest is in the boreal, but the other half of it, the other half of the 1.36 billion hectares is in the tropics, in Southeast Asia and in particular Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and in the Congo Basin and in the Amazon Basin. Much of the international community's attention has been focused in the Congo and the Amazon, but as Professor Jatna has so accurately described, the tropical forests of Indonesia are of profound global significance. And primary, as Professor Jatna has said, primary forests are actually critical for avoiding pandemics. And they're also critical for meeting other national commitments on the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Because that's because they provide ecosystem services and particular qualities and quantities of those ecosystem services that are superior to other forest types, in particular degraded and secondary regrowth forests and planted forests, plantation forests. So in addition to their role in quarantining pathogens, they're also the home to Indigenous peoples and culture and provide livelihoods for local communities. They are one of the world's most important stocks of carbon, ecosystem carbon stocks. They also provide the cleanest and least polluted and least sedimented clean water. They provide a role at scale in regional climate regulation, particularly in terms of rainfall. And of course, they provide flourishing wildlife habitat for our biodiversity species. As Professor Jetner said, a critical issue here is the passage of spillover from wildlife to domestic animals. And this has been, and if we're not careful, will continue to be, it's caused significant epidemics and pandemics worldwide. And it's been, it's been empirically established that deforestation and degradation are associated with infectious disease emergence. This is not theoretical, this is empirically established. And the fact of the matter is that commercial logging, mining, plantations, and associated infrastructure developments open up primary forests for wildlife hunting, poaching, and bushmeat trade, and dramatically increase the contact with hosts and the exposure of humans to potential pathogens. And what it turns out, one of the most important mechanisms is actually the increase in forest edge effects. As we begin to open up and fragment an intact primary forest, we create more edge between the core habitat and the degraded habitat. And it's the edges that are driving these interspecies contacts between humans, wildlife animal, or between wildlife animals. Actually, it's between wildlife animals that live in core habitat, and then it can be in domestic or wildlife animals that occur in degraded landscapes or as landscapes, and then their interactions with humans. So a key mechanism is actually this forest edge effect. And as Professor Jetner said, we've got a whole range of infectious diseases: Ebola virus, HIV, monkeypox, COVID-19, Sylvatic dengue, zoonotic malaria, and yellow fever, which are all kind of enabled and accentuated by deforestation and degradation. The other key fact, again, which is often still not well recognised, is the important role the primary tropical forests play in sequestering and storing carbon, and hence the critical role they have to play in helping countries, forest-rich countries such as Indonesia, meet their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So the living biomass carbon alone in primary tropical forests is actually equivalent, it's actually about the same as the expendable carbon budget for achieving a 66 probability of limiting global warming to 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. What that means is if we were to stop using fossil fuel tomorrow, but to continue to completely deforest our tropical forests, we will breach the 1.5 degree safeguard. And this map just shows, using Earth systems data, a globally scaled estimate of the carbon stock stored in tropical forests. And as I mentioned, this is especially the case for Indonesia. If we zoom in on Indonesia here, on the right-hand side, we've got a map of current forest cover and the condition. The purple or the non-green colours, if you like, or the grey is for Indonesia is non-forest. The green is forest cover greater than 20% tree cover, and the maroon and blue, or at least that's the colours that appears on my screen, are the closest estimates we have using Earth system data of primary or at least relatively intact forest, tropical forest, or at least that forest which was disturbed some time ago and has made some recovery. So if we just zoom in on the best global Earth system estimate we have of primary forests, we end up with about 12 billion tonnes of ecosystem carbon in those forests, which is about 358 tonnes per hectare. That's total biomass carbon above and below ground plus soil carbon. This is a globally significant stock of carbon. So protecting that primary forest from degradation, human degradation, avoids future emissions. So a really important mitigation strategy for Indonesia is to protect its current primary forest, because that avoids anthropogenic emissions and can make a significant contribution to global mitigation goals. However, and Indonesia, is probably the world first in having a national policy commitment to primary forest protection. But I think, as everyone listening to this webinar will understand, operationalizing these commitments requires a lot of work. We need to look at what kind of mechanisms can be implemented when we're looking at a landscape approach, when we're looking at sustainable landscape management at scale. What are the mechanisms we have? Well, one mechanism is formal protected areas like national parks. Others are community conserved areas. These are particularly important where you have Indigenous and local communities. The other thing we can think about is the role of restoring and reforesting degraded landscapes. We need to be thinking about this in conjunction with the existing primary forest, whether it's looking at the boundaries of large primary forest areas, or whether we're looking at remnant patches of primary forest within largely disturbed landscapes. So we can think about, with our landscape planning, how we can strategically locate our forest restoration and reforestation work to buffer the boundaries of big primary forest areas, to link remnant patches, and to ecologically rehabilitate these degraded areas. This is an area that, this is an approach to forest management we're calling pro-forestation. And of course, this will also play a major role and be really helpful in terms of reducing those edge effects that drive interspecies contacts and that increase the risk of passage and spillover and pandemics. So when we're looking at sustainable landscape management, and we're looking at where we're doing ecological forest restoration and ecological restoration, we need to be thinking about how we can buffer and link our primary forest areas and remnants to reduce edge effects and reduce that risk of pathogen contact or interspecies contact and pathogen spillover and pandemics. The other key policy reform that's needed here is really to do with the microeconomics and the macroeconomics of how we recognise and account for the benefits we derive from better protecting and maintaining our existing primary forests and the role they have to play in helping avoiding pandemics and avoiding anthropogenic emissions. We have national systems of economic accounting. The UN is developing systems of environmental economic accounting. But what we need to make sure is that those accounting rules, those national accounting rules, recognise the benefits from the avoided harm, from the avoided emissions, from the avoided loss of biodiversity, from the avoided interspecies contact and spillovers, from investing in primary forest protection and making sure we don't have further loss and degradation of those primary forests. Those primary forests deliver real concrete benefits for pandemics, for mitigation commitments, for fresh water, for sustainable livelihoods, for biodiversity. So we need a way of recognising that and measuring that and recording that in our national systems of environmental and economic accounting. Because if we do that, we've then got a basis for rewarding people, whether it's the provincial government, whether it's the government agencies managing the land, whether it's the local communities. If we can recognise and account for these benefits, that's the basis for rewarding people for helping us to do that. So we need to be thinking about how we can integrate primary forest protection into land use planning and landscape managers' approaches. What I want us to do is to not think that, primary forests are over there and the landscapes we're managing here. We need to bring them into our integrated landscape management approaches. And when we do that, we can start thinking about how we can best make use of the degraded land. So, you know, if there's an increased demand for commercial plantations, we should be looking at putting them in already cleared and degraded landscapes, rather than looking at natural degrade, you know, rather than encroaching further into the boundaries or periphery of primary forests. So that was my last slide, and I'll end there and hand back to our chair.
Thank you, Brendan, and thanks for your giving some global insights on primary forests and also the concept of different levels of significance. I think that's you know, we're looking usually at, you know, primary forests at the same level, but it's good to know there's different levels of significance as well, and also which mechanisms should be used to protect them. Thank you for your contribution with that. So I'd like to move to sort of hearing the thoughts of our last speaker, our last guest, Mr. Fitrian. Just wanted to remind everyone just to put in your questions through the Q&A section if you have any questions, but most importantly also because we have very limited time to upvote. So if you do see any questions that are similar, or perhaps, you know, have similar thoughts that you have, and it saves you from typing it all down, just upvote them, and then we can pose those questions to our panel after. So Mr. Fitrian, please go ahead and share your thoughts on maybe on how we can ensure moving into that environmental economics, economic recovery from that COVID-19, and how that sort of looks like in terms of forest protection.
Thank you, Maggie. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First, of course, thank you so much for this good opportunity from Universitas Indonesia and Griffith University. I'm also delighted to have Pak Yatna, one of my gurus, and of course, Pak Rama Bitular, one of my gurus. Thank you so much, and Leah, a good friend. So I just want to directly add on to what Pak Yatna and also Professor Brandon have mentioned regarding the challenge that we are facing now. But before going to that, I just want to say something about IDH briefly. What we've been doing so far is basically a different type of model in terms of supporting landscapes as well as sourcing area. We want to provide what we call a business and investment model, so the landscape can be managed in a sustainable way in the long run. So what we want to see is that we want to create investment coming in, a good type of investment, a green type of investment, supporting those commodities, linking to communities as well as the private sector and the local government, so they can depend on themselves rather than depend on charity or grants or whichever. And in the long run, we also want to transform the perceived drivers of deforestation, those commodities, into even more positive ways, in something that even address and mitigate deforestation or restore forests. Eventually, these are our project areas and also interventions. So the model is that we contribute or we co-invest with the private sector. We provide 30% from our own investment, and 70% can come from the private sector and other type of supporters. But of course, we know before we talk about the COVID-19 challenges, we know that at this point of time, Pak Yatna, Professor Brandon have mentioned correctly, the environmental impacts, fires, deforestations, wildlife, habitat degradation, and whatnot. But on the other hand, we are also facing tremendous challenges when it comes to the low level of productivity of our farmers, the quality that they are producing from the products of agriculture, and of course, because of that, eventually they got also low level of welfare. So you got into this kind of vicious cycle. If you want to address environmental degradations and deforestation, like it or not, you have to address this type of poverty, welfare, and issues related to productivity of farmers and villages across Indonesia and also across developing countries. So this is something that we have been pushing for 4 or 5 years in Indonesia and in these regions, as simple as helping farmers. But of course, there are millions of farmers. You cannot just help them to transform their activities, to transform their business model. So you need to support or strengthen at least the aggregators of farmers. It can be cooperatives, it can be local firms, it can be through the off-takers, big brands that are sourcing from the farmers. and of course, working together with the financiers. I think the combinations of the triangle of aggregators linking to the off-takers, because then you can get guarantee of off-takings in the long runs, and of course financier, then you can get also guarantee of investment. It will eventually, this is our theory of change, ensure the sustainability of landscape or sourcing area transformations for addressing those issues that we have already discussed. But of course, if we want to break it down, there are plenty of things that we have to do. But just to make it as simple as possible, first, of course, we have to work with the government, so the government can produce the right type of policies. We call it Green Growth Plan. The Green Growth Plan is a kind of policy that then can produce a signal to the private sector, to the local communities, that good investment, responsible business models are needed. And then with this Green Growth Plan, it will then be transformed into what we call midterm development planning, RPGMD. And then because of it is then transformed in RPGMD, it will be then transformed into the budgeting system. We need to take notes that without the inclusion of activities in the budget of the government from the national, provincial, district level, or even village level, there won't be any activities of green investment or protections of forests or peatland and what have you. So you have to ensure this is happening. So this is something that we want to push without the multi-stakeholder collaboration. That's why we push what we call PPI Compact. Professor Yatna has mentioned production protections. We put another I, which is inclusions, because we want to see that it's not only about productions or productivity of the supply chains or protections of the environment, but also inclusions of villages or smallholders. So with this, we want to see that there are policies they are for the support from the private sectors and others. So these just the examples. We've been working with 6 or 7 provinces across Indonesia, developing such green growth plans, like I mentioned, transforming this green growth plan into RPGMD, the midterm development planning, and the budgeting system, but then breaking it down into what we call verified sourcing area. Verified sourcing area is a bit different to certifications. In the verified sourcing area, we want to get the Bupati as a leader and also private sector in that particular jurisdiction to work together to show that whatever produces or whatever products coming from these particular districts or jurisdictions can be or supported or considered as sustainable or verifiable. First, we want to then have this kind of end buyers commitment, where we have this kind in Aceh with PepsiCo, Unilever, Musimas, in Musi Banyu Asin as well in South Sumatra, and then developing the supply chain transparency, a system in which people can look at the progress or improvement of no deforestation, peatland protections, human rights, local and social conflict address, and so forth. And of course, a platform developed based on the PPI Complex or the Agreement on Production Protection Inclusion. But of course, this is not the end game. The end game, or one of the end games, is to get as much as possible our investment partners coming in. In the past, we have already seen that many investment coming into land-based economy activities across Indonesia or developing countries, leading to destructions of forests, peatlands, or a different ecosystem. Now we want to turn the tide. We said to our investment partners, can you do something, package this kind of investment in which you can provide a guarantee of risk or reductions of risk, in which then the banks can combine in terms of syndications, support the local banks, support the producer companies in those jurisdictions, linking to the cooperatives and farmers in so that the farmers can be seen as not risky anymore. So within this kind of different investment partners, from Green Fund to TLFF, Tropical Landscape Finance Facility, we have been successful in supporting, developing, and also issuing some sort of deals. I can show it to you. This is just an examples, because if we don't talk about investment, if we don't talk about money, some people may not like it, but if we don't talk about concrete money coming in to support this kind of activities, there won't be any change. I have to be honest with this. So that's why if we want to see that rubbers, palm oil being developed without deforestation, we have also to show that there is money to support it, there's investment to support it. And of course, it's not only about big or small a medium company. It's also about supporting smallholders, supporting local communities or villages. There are example, for instance, in West Kalimantan, a 6 million euro released by the Indonesian government, soft loan in Padang Tikar village forest. I can show it to you here. Like 4 years ago, they've been given these villagers a license to operate or to manage village forests amounting of 76,000 hectares in these particular jurisdictions. Of course, the challenge is, can they show that they can manage these forests while eventually also protect the forests in the long run? So we work together with local organizations, with the village forest people and communities and organizations, first to develop their organizations, secondly to develop their business model, identify whatever sustainable activities or commodities that can be developed further, and then link that to the off-takers and of course eventually financiers. So in addition to this 6 million euro coming from the government as a soft loan, now we are also discussing with a different type of investment coming in for coconut charcoal, for crabs, fisheries, honey, and whatnot. So now, when we come to the new challenge that we are facing, the COVID-19, of course, in the bigger picture, it has disturbed so many different activities of our land-based economies. It has disturbed our logistical supply chain. It has disturbed the demand and supply. And as a result, without or having the reductions of the demand, then you can see that farmers will get less when it comes to the incentives or the revenues coming in. And if they got less incentive, there are two options, of course. They can be innovative in finding ways to develop their own business model, or they can expand. And the expansion could take place in forest or peatland. So we don't want to see this happening. So we have to work together with the off-takers, again, with the financier, to find ways to incentivize or to adjust the different business models with farmers, with local governments in different commodities, in different supply chains, in different areas of Indonesia. So we work, for instance, now with PISAGRO, Partnership for Indonesia Sustainable Agricultures, consisting of different companies, off-takers, and whatnot, to find what sort of things that can be done within this pandemic period, but also in the new normal, so to speak, and of course in the long run. One thing that we observe, and now we are tried this kind of intervention, is that it seems that people or supply chains and companies, and of course farmers, look for options in terms of digitizing their supply chain. So I think there's a good opportunity. In urban area, we have seen the transformation of digitalizations of the economy. The online ojek, for instance, has helped to some extent. The ojek pangkalan, which is used to be sporadic and not necessarily being able to lift up the economy, but now with that kind of agglomeration and aggregations of the online ojek system, it can help to some extent. I mean, we are thinking that kind of things also with villages, with supply chains, and with farmers. And secondly, there's also an opportunity now with big data. Can this also be helped not only to support farmers to get access to the market and finance, but also to address the issues of deforestation and addressing also restorations, making sure that it's not about the healthiness of the welfare or the livelihood of the people, but also the ecosystem surrounding those villages. So I think this is quite important. Last but not least, in this case, I think it's also about consumers shift. They are now more and more thinking. Of course, we need to identify and see whether this is true in the long run. But they are more and more thinking of buying healthier products and good products coming from the supply chain. So this could be also a good opportunity for sustainable products. This is just of some of the example that we did or we are doing with farmers. The first one, for instance, with shrimp farmers. In the past and before COVID-19, we worked and collaborated with a particular organization developing a big data, a digital platform to identify disease in aquaculture, because disease is a huge risk in aquaculture investment. But because of COVID-19, we together changed the platform into also linking the aquaculture farmers to local and regional market, because usually they exported the products to the United States or Europe, But because of the COVID-19, all this kind of market has reduced their kind of requirement or sourcing. Farmers need to find some option. So I think that we need to find ways within this COVID-19 and also in the new normal, combinations of market of global, regional, and also national and local level. Secondly, there's an example of honey farms with the village forest. There has been an increase of 500% of the demand for good products, for healthy products, for instance, including honey. So we see the opportunity to have this kind of type of supply chain maybe to be strengthened and to be aggregated. Someone needs to do that. Last but not least, even with the COVID-19, there is now a movement in which the financial sector consolidating themselves to see what sort of deals that they can do, in which it's not only going to be strengthening their portfolio in the COVID-19, but also in the long run. So with Ant Green Fund, with different companies, we push for different deals in different commodities and sector with different companies, and also villager and smallholders, to find ways. It's not only about investing in productivity, but also investing in productivity, sustainability, protections, production, inclusions in those commodities. So I will stop, but I think it is quite a good opportunity, like it or not, to reflect on things that we consider as business as usual, and the new normal will give us some ideas of what are the business and investment model that can survive in the long run. Thank you, Maggie, and over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitian, and thanks for that that presentation, highlighting also the economical part of conservation and forest conservation. Because if you want to address sort of environmental degradation, you will have to address livelihoods and poverty alleviation, whether this through microfinance system investments, business modeling, and any successful conservation program will have livelihood development integrated into that project. And you can see that throughout the world in conservation projects where there is a strong focus on that livelihood development. So I think that is a positive where we're moving in that direction. And I also think this really leads into our first question that has been posed, and this is a question for all panelists, and it was asked sort of fairly early into the seminar. So I'd like to raise that. Some of the panel have already answered that, but I think it's good to sort of raise that sort of live. And it's a question from Hans Nicholas Young, who mentioned that the Indonesian government recently announced 89 of priority projects to stimulate the economy post-pandemic. And you see that throughout the world as well. Australia has also projects now in place to stimulate that economy post-pandemic, to think about ways to get that back on its feet. And within Indonesia, among those priority projects, you'd have infrastructure projects like roads, dams, railroads, as well as paddy fields and peatlands. So what are the thoughts of the panel on the concerns of the impact of large-scale infrastructure projects, maybe even also for Indonesia and Australia for their landscape and forests? Is there a concern in regards to those large-scale infrastructure projects to help, getting the economy back on its feet? And I guess I'll start with Professor Jatna to answer that.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Hans, for the question. I think that my research in 2018 on the impact of infrastructures toward the forests, existing forests in Kalimantan, it's very clear. It's a very big impact because they are across all these forests, they're intact forests and becoming fragmented, and that's really vulnerable to many other things. You can imagine that. But I think after this, of course everybody has mentioned, they will be trying to get the easy cash, which is the forest again. So there's proposal to have a rice field, the former mega rice project and many others. I think we really need to give the alternative solution For example, instead of the infrastructure, we can say the green infrastructure. So what does it really mean? That we have to calculate what's the impact, the impact not only as Fitrian mentioned about the community, inclusiveness is very important. So because as I mentioned, because it's the pandemic thing, people are trying to get things easily, using digital technology like us, and forget it that community has to be brought to be in the table, understanding, and so on and so on. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be conflict. It's going to be too long, to solve those things. So the green infrastructure has to be brought. I think this is very important to have that, like low carbon development, green, like solar energy, water energy, sometimes dam, if you hydroelectric dam, sometimes it's very good, but of course there has to be in proper ways, I think that's really in the very short answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jatna. That's a really interesting points you've raised in regards to taking the community into account, and that probably comes with really highlighted stakeholder engagement and looking at what their priorities are for communities as well. So that's wonderful. Professor Brendan, do you have any ideas for Australia, maybe as well for Indonesia? But you can see here within Australia that there's also lots of focus on that economic development post COVID-19, and whether that would have any impact on Australia's landscape and forest, and maybe also some thoughts on that infrastructure development for a developing country like Indonesia.
Yes, this is a very big concern for us. The kinds of policies and programs the government is going to be promoting in order to advance post-pandemic economic recovery and economic regeneration. Because most of the proposals we're hearing to date have been largely ones that are, I would argue, at the expense of advancing climate resilient landscape management. So they've proposed to subsidise a significant expansion of coal seam gas mining, or what in North America they call fracking. This has huge impacts on our fertile agricultural land. You all know that Australia has a big continental land mass, but 70% of it's basically arid or semi-arid. It's only the coastal fringes where there's, and some inland areas to the east, where there's fertile soil. And big areas in Queensland, for example, of our kind of very scarce, relatively scarce and highly valuable fertile farming land, agricultural land, has already been targeted and is going to be targeted even further for coal seam gas mining, which has huge impacts on the groundwater and hence landscape productivity. And in fact, and that coal seam gas is not for domestic production, it's for export. So it's basically an export commodity business. So again, it's not really going to be generating a lot of local jobs. There's going to be some royalty tax revenues for state and federal governments, and some big corporations will benefit. But that's one issue. The other thing we're seeing, you would have heard that we had our big mega fires this summer. Some 6 or 7 million hectares of forest burnt. Unlike tropical forests, Australian forests have evolved so that they're quite well adapted to survive and regenerate following wildfires. However, again, as part of economic recovery, the governments are looking at intensifying commodity production within our native forests. Again, this I think will be to the detriment of sustainability. So yes, there's quite a big policy debate happening at the moment in terms of the kinds of post-COVID-19 restriction economic activities that are going to be promoted and subsidised and incentivised. And of course, there's a growing voice that these should be promoting climate resilience and not undermining it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. It's good to obviously give that insight from the Australian perspective as well, because both Indonesia and Australia have different ways of approaching that economical downturn. Mr. Fitrian Astianasia, in your thoughts about that green infrastructure in regards to getting back on the feet with that in those projects like roads and dams. Are there any, what is the progress in regards to that following the landscape management approach and that green infrastructure?
Hi Maggie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we have to face with challenging reality now. Of course, as a developing countries, Indonesia needs to develop, and of course, part of the development would require some sort of infrastructure development. But like I mentioned, I think in the answers that I typed, first we have to assess what sort of infrastructures that we need to support our economic activities. And of course, eventually also not only the overall national economic activity, but the local regional economic activities. I think the process needs to be transparent, so to speak, and it needs to include public consultations, and there is also what I suspect that requires a good comprehensive assessment in which infrastructures that needs to be developed needs to be suitable also with the local regional ecosystem. Whether this has been done, it has been done in some areas, maybe not as wide as we want to see. And there are plenty of information, best practices, case studies that have shown that there are responsible green infrastructures. I think we can push for that rather than saying no. We need to say that, okay, what sort of infrastructures that we need? But before that, what sort of economy that we need? Do we want to have an economy like before COVID-19, in which lots of exploitations, lots of brown industry and so forth that have taken place? Then we need to be also clever in saying to our own government, because we fought for them, that we need the economy, but what sort of economy that we need? And then with that, what sort of infrastructure that we need? I think if we can voice that kind of concerns as clever as possible with a provision of some sort of solutions, I do see that there's no way for the government not to hear and also not to entertain that kind of clever discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. So really your viewpoint is really economical, using economical reasoning to push that green infrastructure as well. So that's great. I guess it also leads into the question from Rudy Hidayat sorry, just looking into the government's commitment to policies that protect primary forests. So obviously there can be guidance and there can be advice that can be posed to a government, but should there be a type of commitment to policies that protect those primary forests? And I guess that also includes that the economy going forward, whether that should include the protection of primary forests. And it's in practice really far from commitments at the moment. And he poses that it's because if deforestation continues to be carried out by the private sector in exploiting Indonesia's primary forests, what are the attitudes and actions of forestry experts who are concerned about climate change issues? Because so far, the input from experts and environmental activists is only considered as not valuable information. So I guess what Rudy's concerned about is that there's not really the voice from environmental activists and experts are not really taken into account within that sort of political landscape. What are your thoughts on that, Professor Jatna? And you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. I think very important that the government itself already put a lot of effort. For example, they have moratorium for the primary forest or intact forests. So the president decree that already secured all these primary forests in Indonesia. So you cannot convert it. But of course that legally the most important is how do we prevent the illegally, which is that because of the after COVID, people really need cash, and this is the thing that really need, which means that the government really need to effort to more involve communities, people who impacted by the COVID, toward how do we get that cash, you know. Pak Vidrian mentioned about many other things, you know, developing communities in the graded land. They can be social forestry, you know, they can be many others. So in the, for example, the IDH, Pak Vidrian, can really support that kind, not only the government, but also a lot of private sector and a lot of NGOs. Yeah, the time that for the after the COVID is not really good to just hammering the government, but trying to steer the government how to get the possibilities revenue, you know, because the trade-off, of course, is very important. Scientists has to do a lot of research on the trade-off possibilities, because that oil palm may be not good, because when, you know, the transportation is not really good, and also the commodity itself is not really in, because not really in demand. So it's the sometimes the community really involved, right? Like cocoa and many other that's small, that was really not big, because they are not so much so for that kind of. But the community that is very easy to cash, you know, just like the maize and many other, but not having go to the Parimba forest, because, you know, there are many million hectares that is really degraded land. So I mean, if you get that degraded land to be restored, so I think the government can pay them to restore the areas as part of the future reforestation. So in the long run, so that Indonesia can get earned with this the carbon market and many others. You know, that's really the ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Brendan, what are your thoughts on trying to get more of a voice from experts and maybe environmental activists or people pushing that environmental agenda to be taken into account and having their voices heard?
Well, I guess there's two approaches needed. One is, we need to be looking at ways in which the evidence we have, scientific evidence we have about the values and benefits of primary forests, how that can be better translated into policy. And I mentioned one very briefly in my presentation, which is about the national system of economic accounts. You know, they can be expanded to have environmental dimension, because at the moment a lot of environmental benefits are not registered in the national environmental accounts. It's part of the problem we have at a national policy level. So the UN, and I'm sure Indonesia Division of Statistics as part of this process, have been developing environmental economic accounting systems, so that the benefits from the ecosystem services we get from natural ecosystems and semi-natural ecosystems are recorded there in our economic accounts. And I think that's one thing we can do to help translate the science into policy. The other avenue is really, I fully agree with what Professor Jatner was saying, which is we really need to be developing systems, and I think our other speakers spoke to this as well. You know, we need to be developing business models that enable, you know, benefits to materially flow to those local communities who live in and around and adjacent to and on the borders of primary forests. Because they, in the end, those forests will be protected if those communities want them to be protected. They're the best line of defence against the illegal logging activities that are now occurring. And this is where I think the notion of payment for ecosystem services comes in. You know, we need to be recognising and measuring the benefits that flow from that the avoided harm and other benefits that flow from protected primary forests, and doing microeconomic analysis that enables some dollar value to be put on them, and to set up systems so that the local communities, are actually financially rewarded. There's some flow of income from the role they play in helping prevent those illegal activities. So we need a system that better registers what the ecosystem service benefits are, and we need some kind of market-based or either or a combination of funds and market mechanisms for getting some financial flows to reward those local communities. And there also has to be fair benefit sharing with other stakeholders. I mean, provincial governments and local governments have an important role to play here too. They need to be part of these systems that are put in place. So they're my two suggestions.
Maggie, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Professor Brendan. I think your comments also bring home what Mr. Fitchian was talking about in terms of the ecosystem services. And Mr. Fitchian, do you think the ecosystem services platform would then also make this balance of development and the environment with the current administration more of a priority to looking at sort of forest conservation? This is answering question of Andi Mohammed Ibnu Akil from the Jakarta Post.
Trend in which there is a good appetite, not only from the government, but more importantly, from the private sector. Because if the private sector doesn't say that they need this kind of things, the ecosystem services, the government also will not listen. So unfortunately, that's the reality. So with the appetite from the private sector globally, with their commitments to reduce deforestation, to reduce their carbon footprint, then they ask governments globally, but also nationally, to show what sort of opportunity to do it within our jurisdictions. And with that now, Professor Yatna knows this exactly. There are now activities in which the Indonesian government also has been trying, and to some extent quite successful. That's why just recently they got good payment coming from the Norwegian government when it comes to carbon emission reductions, result-based payment. So it has shown that if you do it right, if you do it correctly, you can get this kind of payment from carbon or ecosystem services. So that's one of the things. Secondly, we need also to combine this with local and regional economic activities, because there have been some sort of two perceptions in which if you want to develop your economy, you don't need the carrying capacity from the environment or the ecosystem. We have to combine those in our narratives, in our political decision-making processes within the, let's say, provincial boundaries or district boundaries. And with that, we can say that, okay, to grow rice, to grow coffee, to grow palm oil, or to grow whatever, you need those water, you need those ecosystem, you need those forests, the catchment area and whatnot. So how can then we evaluate and then incorporate that kind of norms into the economic activities? And then we then have that kind of agreement locally with from the suppliers of the ecosystem services and the buyers of ecosystem services. I think I've seen good models in Lombok, for instance, for water payment, in West Java as well, or Banten for water payment. But we need to scale these things up and show that this can be replicable across Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess it leads into then who should be the convener for the landscape approach in Indonesia. So it's really having the importance of that platform, but who should be convening that and raising that with the Indonesian government, and should Bapeda of the province be involved, since it is about bioregionalism that may span more than 3 to 4 kabupaten, and kabupaten for international participants, it's like a region, so it's spread over different regions, 3 to 4 different regions. So any thoughts on that, Mr. Maybe Professor Jatna would be good to answer this one when we were talking about sort of that that landscape approach and who should convene that that platform.
Thank you, Maggie. I think the first thing that the government is already initiate is the one map policy. Means that a lot of map, like 100 maps on the many different about the sectors, mining, forestry, agriculture, and many other things, so that we can prioritize which one is for this area and this kabupaten, this province. And then every sectors in the government, the central government, provincial government, and kabupaten level, they can work together in one. Otherwise, they will be, overlapping, which is that really a bad thing, because there has to be in the one landscape, big landscape, so that there is, of course, a protected area or area that considered to be protecting for the, as mentioned before, for the ecosystem services, for water, for many others, but the similarly for the economy. So, between the protection and production, they can be hand in hand, but you cannot just everything to be production, which is in the landscape, it's a very important. That's why one map policy, and also I want to put it one again, one health, because otherwise there is also a question about one health. Why is it? I thought that, so sectoral. This is the health of human. What about the health of the animal or the health of the forest? Because they are interconnected. So that's why I said only one policy, one map policy, but also one health policy. That's really my suggestion.
Thank you for that, Professor Jatna. Mr. Fitrin, did you have any responses towards that as well?
Yeah, this is a billion-dollar question, I think, to get the answer right. What Professor Jatna said, it's entirely correct. But in terms of convener, I think we need to find ways in which, like it or not, the government needs to show and also to provide leaderships. Because without the government leaderships, there won't be any change within the policies, with the budget. Again, I want to emphasize the budget. Even if you got the commitment and policy without that translated into budget, there won't be any activities on the ground. And then within the government, you need to find a good, let's say, agency that can manage or liaise with different sectors. To some extent, in provincial boundaries, you got Bapeda, of course, but Bapeda needs to get support directly from the governor, as well as from different sectors. And you need to also have this kind of attachment with the private sector association or liaison and civil society. This kind of combination, then it will ensure that whatever things that are being agreed or produced will be followed or complied by at least the majority of stakeholders. Thank you.
Maggie, you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Maybe Professor Brendan Mackey would also be able to highlight how that would look like in an Australian sort of landscape. So bringing that landscape approach to the Australian political agenda, and who would convene that at this level here?
Yes. So to answer that question, from Australian perspective, we need to understand the difference, I think, in our national constitution. So in Australia, matters of land management are the responsibilities of the state governments, our state governments, and not the federal government. So the federal government's role in sustainable land management is indirect rather than direct. It has full authority under the Constitution to implement land management in order to give effect to international treaty obligations. So when you look at the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Paris Agreement, that has, amongst others, that has enormous direct implications for land management. So on one hand, our national government can, using various international treaty obligations, really do whatever it wants to do on the land. It chooses to do that through collaborative mechanisms. So we have if you like, a system of governance that involves the national government sitting down with the state governments, our equivalent of your provinces, and arriving and trying to arrive at kind of consensus about how to deal with these land management issues. The government's also got has got taxation power, so it's got a lot of money, so it can also direct a lot of change through funding. So we end up having a very, I would argue, ineffective and confused land use, land management policy generally in Australia. It's largely devolved to the states. The federal government can influence it. There's all sorts of levers it can pull to influence it, but it often chooses not to take a direct path, even though it might even have the constitutional power to do that. So the short answer is we're not going to see in Australia, I don't think anytime soon, a sustainable forest and a sustainable landscape management approach that will be put in place across the whole country by the federal government. If it happens, it will emerge, at different times in different states, I think.
Thank you.
I may not have answered that question particularly well, but it's not in Australia, land use is a very complicated domestic political issue.
No, that's good. It's good to just provide a sort of a different perspective, because it might also give some ideas on which could be successful as well in Indonesia if an Australian viewpoint could be used for that at the same time. And looking at sort of alleviating poverty is probably not as a pressing issue within Australia as for Indonesia, even though there is poverty that is becoming apparent during the pandemic year as well. But that's always been part of the national program to alleviate poverty in Indonesia. So this is another question.
Yes, if I could just jump in there, Maggie. So
yeah.
Again, the big pressure we have on our landscapes in Australia is not from the need for economic development to alleviate poverty. It's unsustainable land use from industrial scale exploitation of our natural resources. That's where the lack of sustainability is coming from in our landscape management.
Yeah, and I guess that leads into different factors of that economic sort of development, and for Indonesia it would be alleviating poverty. And one of the questions that was posed here is looking at that national program to alleviate poverty in Indonesia and reduce deforestation by 30%, because it reduced the need for poor farmers, for example, to deforest land to compensate for rice farming losses, for example. Have you noticed similar trends during your work? And have you seen an indication of increase in deforestation due to the economic pressure caused by the pandemic? And it's probably just like a case study or personal experiences as well. Like I've seen from colleagues even in Africa with the loss of tourism, for example. And I think tourism is going to be covered in the next webinar, but obviously compensating the loss of tourism income and that economic income has seen sort of a displacement of trying to receive income in different ways. Have you seen any way of compensation in your work or in your region for that matter, Professor Jatna?
After the pandemic, we have not studied yet, but it's really important. Maybe it's scientists has to look at the many possibilities, understanding what is really COVID, but related to this kind of, not only pandemic, but economic downturn, for example, in 1997, that is really clear. We need to anticipate how to get this economy back to the normal. Of course, that really has been anticipated, that maybe but there has to be, for example, I gave an example of the possible of the mega rice revitalization. I think we have studied this on the Academy, Indonesia Academy of Science, already possibilities of the other, not in the mega rice, because the mega rice, it's really in the peatland areas, which is that very easy to catch fire and emission so high. So I think there has to be in other areas, like, of course, there is a lot of handicaps, for example, or challenges. For example, in Merauke, there is a lot of areas that possible for developing rice, instead of in the area that very sensitive for environmentally sensitive for development of the mega rice. So I think instead of saying no, I think we have to give the alternative, to develop this area for rice, for example, and many others. I think there's effort has to be taken. I think Fitrian mentioned about even we guarding the forest, for example, just like the RBP from Norway. It's really an example that when we are guarding the forest, we have the ecosystem services, somebody will pay for that. So I think there are a lot of initiative like that, possible of the premium economic, instead of just how to fulfill the requirement after the COVID, which is really need, because the economic downturn is really huge, of course. Contraction maybe 2-3%, or maybe even 5%, or maybe Indonesian becoming negative so the recession is going to be big. But that really doesn't mean that we have not so much alternative. I think that's when the scientist has to, working together with the economists, with many others, to work together, so that's why the Sustainable Development Goal is for. Maggie?
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Fitrian, have you had any evidence or any accounts on this as well?
Yeah, the one slide that I mentioned earlier regarding village forests in West Kalimantan has shown that if you can provide a good business model and economic returns to local communities, eventually local communities, or short terms after that, the local communities will gladly help protecting the remaining forests. So in fact, help restoring and regenerating forests. Of the 70,000 hectares of village forests, they managed to even regenerate and restore or protect additionally 5,000 hectares. So it is quite remarkable. Within this pandemic, of course, I'm not a scientist, we haven't assessed, but we see that as long as you can provide options, they know this is a difficult situation, but if you can provide options for their products, linking to market, linking to financiers, they are committed as ever to support and to protect the remaining forests with the honey, with the coconuts and whatnot. And in Jambi, for instance, even smallholders palm oil has managed to protect the remaining high conservation value areas because they see the benefits coming from certification or premium of the certification. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you so much. And I think that leads into our final question to the panel, and looking at, we've looked at sort of policy and governance and sort of a top-down approach as to what the government could implement in terms of growing more interest for that landscape approach. But also we have to look at the role of communities and how they can support that same idea of a landscape approach and working together to protect our forests. So the question from Sandy Leo on the role of Indigenous communities in protecting and using the landscape potencies against a conflict of interest between government, private sector and the community. So it's really a matter of that conflict resolution from a bottom-up approach. So how can a community, and in this case an Indigenous community, and maybe also from an Australian perspective, we have a lot of traditional owners and Indigenous communities, how can they assist in that process of, you know, the protection and using the landscape potencies? Professor Brendan, would you like to start off with that one, please?
So could you just clarify the question a little bit more, Maggie?
Yeah, so it's basically the question is in regards to the role of Indigenous communities in the protection and use of landscape potencies. There's the conflict, there's a current conflict often between different government, private sectors and communities, so that conflict resolution, what could be the role of a community to ease that process of protection and play a larger role in that aspect as well?
Well, I think traditional Indigenous communities, who have been the customary guardians and custodians of these forests for millennia, you know, have a critical role to play. We have a lot to learn from them. Their cultures are of the forest, and they understand the forest, and you know, they value it in ways that we've forgotten. So I think we have much to learn from our Indigenous forest dwelling people as to the importance of these forests and why we should be keeping them rather than just exploiting them for kind of short-term profit. Secondly, you know, being of the forest and living in the forest, they know often best how to manage them and look after them. So again, if society is getting benefits from having those forests there, we need to set up systems and incentives so that they can, you know, receive fair benefit sharing. If we're receiving benefits from having those forests there, those benefits need to be shared in some material way. They also need capacity building and the resources that they need to help protect the forest from illegal logging, for example. I mean, if you want an Indigenous community to protect the forest from illegal logging, you need to give them the resources and capacity and support to do that. We have a global project on primary forests and climate change, and we're looking at 7 case studies around the world where we're looking with local partners. And one of them is in the Brazilian Amazon with the CAIPSDCC nation of tribes. And again, there's been a major body of work there around giving them the resources and capacity to actually patrol the border of their lands. And they have well-organised communication channels with government officials who, when they find illegal activity, they can report it, and the government will send in police and other enforcement agencies to protect it. So I think that Indigenous communities, you know, again, the people living in a forest, with a forest, are best placed to help protect it. They need to be given material benefit, you know, there needs to be fair benefit sharing with them, and they need resources and capacities to do that. One of the mechanisms that's been developed in Australia, which has proven to be very successful and very popular with our Indigenous people, is what we call, in Australia, we call an Aboriginal Ranger Program or Indigenous Ranger Program. This is a program particularly targeted at youth in the Indigenous communities, and they're trained in modern forest conservation management practices, but as well, they're also the bridge to the traditional knowledge. So Indigenous communities have got traditional knowledge about their forest management, and what we need are some mechanisms that enable that traditional knowledge to be brought together with our modern scientifically based forest conservation management approaches. And the Indigenous Rangers program is a way of building a bridge between training young people from those communities in traditional conservation management practices, and they're also the bridge to their elders who have the traditional knowledge. And we call this the two toolbox approach. The two toolbox approach. You know, the tools from traditional knowledge, the tools from modern conservation management, and they can be applied together. So these Indigenous range of programs, they provide jobs for young people, they keep young people in the community, and they're also a bridge to the traditional knowledge.
Thank you, Professor Mackie. So that's from the Australian perspective. And Professor Yatna, are you able to, for the Indonesian perspective and the role of Indigenous communities, are there such mechanisms in place as well where they are being involved in, for example, capacity building programs or training programs, where there's an exchange of knowledge and that would help to alleviate that conflict between, you know, the government, private sector and community itself as well?
Maggie, I guess, thank you, Brendan. It's brought up that's very good example in Australia. I think in Indonesia, we have, of course, there's NGOs who's working on this, really help the indigenous people, the Aman, and also there are a lot of the government already embracing this indigenous people with the law, and you know, so that they can have the piece of land to work with that, and then even there is a Director General special in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry who's really embracing the indigenous people. So I think policy-wise, I think the only problem is always how do you implement it in the field. That's really the very important, because Indonesia is really big, you know, from Aceh to Papua, we have like 700 tribes of that indigenous people. So that's really important. Of course, each has different tenure right. Also, each has different system, you know, and that was really important. And from the scientific point of view, this is really important that we can help, you know, for example, what is really the medicine that they grow up to. And as mentioned that from Professor Brandon. So scientifically, we can also help them. But at the same time, scientists also can learn from them. That's really not only one way, but also kind of synergizing between the scientists and the traditional, or they call indigenous people. So a lot of initiative, I cannot say one-to-one, but I have been trying really hard in one of the tribe that in North Sumatra, for example, and they also stand up for anything that are really bad for them. And if they are really good, they're embracing them. But of course, there has to be a guideline, for example. But that guideline has been provided by the government and then provided by local government. But it really need to be strengthening of that really between the government, the multi-stakeholder in the area or in the field. That's really my 2 cents, Maggie.
Thank you so much, Professor Jatna. And I guess it's also a matter of resource allocation to provide those mechanisms to those local groups or local NGOs that are working towards, you know, with the communities in that respect as well. So resource allocation and empowerment for those local communities, having voices heard from all types of community members, not just the loud voices, and making sure that everyone can provide some kind of input. So yeah, thank you for that. And just wanted to thank all of our panel members, Mr. Fitchin, Professor Brendan and Professor Jatna, for very valuable comments during this webinar. And we've learned a lot in regards to looking at, you know, not just from a landscape approach perspective, but also taking into account the ecosystem services and economics as well. we have had lots and lots of questions, and we're hoping to answer those following the webinar, and hopefully we can look into how we can do that. We've had a few questions in regards to sharing presentations, and I think Leah can give more clarity about that. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for attending from all over the world. We've had people from the UK attending, as well as from Australia and Indonesia. So it's been definitely a global workshop, a global webinar. So thanks for attending, and thanks for taking part in the discussion and posting your questions as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Maggie, for the wonderful and smooth chairing of this session. And then also for the dear panelists, Prof. Yatna, Prof. Brendan, and Mas Fitrian. And then also you taking the time to answer the question by writing it. So we could cover a lot of the questions. So thank you very much for that. And then also for the participants who stay until the end, it's great to have you here. And then it was such a fruitful and interactive discussion that we have. So that's what we aim to have. Some messages can be taken away or can be taken home for you all, and that we can all learn something, so that this will be a beneficial session. For participants who is asking for the materials, you could perhaps, hold on, I will share the screen, download the material. Okay, Handika will share the screen. Download the materials in the Google Drive. The link is posted in the social media or Facebook page of the Institute for Sustainable Earth and Resources. So you could follow and like the social media, because we are going to promote all of our activities there. Remember that we have this webinar weekly, and for the next webinar, the title would be Wildlife Trade, a Zoonotic Disease, and the Pandemic. We will also have a discussion on ecotourism for economic recovery from COVID-19 for the week after. And then for the last week of the Sustainable Landscape Management series will be community advocacy in promoting sustainable landscape management in times of COVID-19. We're trying to have it every Thursday at 10 a.m. It might change, but we try to do it at that time. It depends on the availability of the speakers. So thank you so much for staying with us. For people who is asking for attendance, we don't need that because we have all your records here through Zoom. And for people in YouTube or in Zoom that requesting certificates, you could send an email here in this screen you could see. And then we're waiting until 12:15 because we have to ensure that the one who gets certificate are the one who is joining since the beginning until the end. So thank you very much for all of you for joining us today, and see you next week. And then don't forget also to follow our social media to get information and updates about our activity. I'm Leah Zakia from the CAIPSDCC, or the Collaborative Australia-Indonesia Programs on Sustainable Development and Climate Change. Thank you so much for joining. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And then you all now can have lunch, but cook by yourself at home. And thank you, Maggie. It was wonderful. Okay, I'll stop the streaming. Stop the recording. And
shall we give